Hi YouTube. I'm going to try and do this in one take because I don't have a lot of time today. I wanted to discuss a couple of things that I've seen in a couple of videos recently. And I guess the overarching theme of this video will be an understanding on my part of why the average person doesn't see any practical use in philosophy. A lot of times when we get engaged in some of these deep philosophical discussions where we're contemplating brain in a vat scenarios and things like that, I can understand why the average person just rejects it out of hand. It's unfortunate. My wife and I were talking on the weekend about a family member who is having a bit of difficulty, and all the other family members are kind of piling on with all kinds of suggestions. You know, you should do this, you should do this, and you know, it's never really amounting to anything. And I was saying to my wife, it's unfortunate, you know, that these people couldn't be a little more philosophical about their approach and sort of recognize the fact that their continued similar approach is not yielding any different results, and that maybe they might modify their approach somewhat and be a little more philosophical. But I can appreciate why the average person rejects philosophy as having any practical value, because quite often when we get into these deep discussions, it gets zany. I'll start by discussing worldviews, and that's a term I'd like to see obviously kind of stricken from the vocabulary, at least in terms of this discussion. I'm guilty of using it as well, usually out of convenience, because I know people will know what I'm speaking of, but it's just one of the most flawed terms we could possibly use. And I think it allows people to pigeonhole other people. And to that end, I would just say, you know, obviously the atheist worldview is a misnomer. It makes no sense. It's not a worldview. I don't think that Christians would appreciate actually being all lumped into one category and you know, sort of being told that they all share a common worldview, because they don't, but certainly not atheists. And to that end, I'll issue a challenge. I am an atheist. Please tell me, based on that, what my views are on abortion, abiogenesis, the Big Bang, theory of evolution, government. Tell me what my views are on, you know, am I liberal? Am I a conservative? Please tell me what my views are on the supernatural. Am I a strict naturalist? Do I believe that all that exists is the natural? Etc., etc. Now, of course, if you know me, you're disqualified from answering this, but I don't think the challenge needs to be answered to understand what I'm getting at here, is that atheism tells you but one basic thing about a person. Sure, there might be a couple of ancillary things that would stem from that, but it's actually much more limited in scope than people would like to think. And so to that end, I would like to use the term belief set, because I think that's a little bit better. The problem with worldviews, and this was illustrated in the Jason Peterson, Alex Botten discussion. The problem with worldview as a term is it suggests that any one given component within that worldview would bring the entire worldview crumbling. And Jason asked that of Alex Botten, which I thought was kind of cute, where he said, you know, if I could show you an inconsistency in your worldview, would you convert to mine? Which I thought was cute. You know, how this became a dichotomy, I'm not sure. And he did modify it. He did say, okay, if I could show you an inconsistency in your worldview, would you reject atheism? Well, no. My entire belief set does not rest on any given one component of it, and I think that's why belief set is better, because it sort of lets you know that it is a set of individual beliefs, and any given belief may or may not be foundational to the overall structure. The other thing that I've noticed is that allowing people to pigeonhole you by using the term worldview, so they can make all these assumptions about you without asking the question, allows people to do that at a micro level as well. And so the assumptions will stem forth like, well, since on your worldview all we are is molecules in motion, that your thoughts are just chemical reactions, then this. Well, wait a minute. Don't you think you should ask the question first? Do you believe that all our thoughts are chemical reactions? That's kind of important. I think you would ask the question first to at least assess that the person you're talking to ascribes to that belief that you're referring to. And of course, that's not done. And this goes on many other things on that micro level. We get into, how could something come from nothing, and all these other, how can you reject, the supernatural, the immaterial, is a concept material or immaterial? Well, wait a minute. Before you get there, don't you think you should make sure that the person outright rejects everything immaterial? Because atheism doesn't tell you that. So I would like to see the term belief set adopted over worldview, or any other term that someone else feels fits the bill. But I think worldview is a terrible one. And I personally don't appreciate having all these assumptions made about me. It's why I never self-identified as an atheist before I came to YouTube. The only reason I did in YouTube is because these labels, at some point tend to become kind of necessary, or they're thrust upon you. But in my private life, I've never self-identified as an atheist. Yes, I would self-identify as being someone who does not believe in the Christian God or the Islamic God or many of the others. The other thing I wanted to discuss is a little bit of the Jason Peterson, Alex Botten discussion and the Matthew Steele, Sye Ten Bruggencate discussion. I thought they were quite interesting. I did see what I would like to see, let's put it this way, is a little more honesty on the part of the presuppositional apologist. Or I don't know if Jason considers himself a presuppositional apologist, but he could certainly use a little bit more honesty in the discussion. I'm not sure where it comes from, this disingenuous approach that they take, if it's a defensive posture or what. But I just think that it doesn't do us any good when we're trying to have a discussion. So for instance, Jason Peterson he made many statements without any argumentation behind them to support them, or they were just sort of bold assertions without any justification, while at the same time demanding that Alex Botten provide him a foundation for his belief set, and by implication asserting that Alex hadn't, when actually he had. And I think that Jason knew this, evidenced by the fact that in a post-debate hangout on the Bible Thumping Wingnut channel, he admitted as much. He admitted as much that he knew what Alex's foundations were because he had said them to him. But what he was holding out for was him to make a declarative statement. Here are my presuppositions or my founding principles. But Alex did do that. And I find that highly disingenuous that he would keep pressuring him on this. Now, the reason I think that he was doing it, and I could be wrong, but just based on past experience with many presuppositional apologists, is the idea is to keep the opponent on the defense and not allow them to start moving towards the offense. And Alex was doing a good job of trying to stay on the offense. He kept saying, you haven't justified that the very, very foundation for your belief set even exists, and that's kind of important. And Jason would say things like, well, on my worldview, we can answer all these deep philosophical problems, and on yours we can't. He also made the assertion that his foundational principles don't have to be justified, that you don't have to justify those in philosophy. And I'm not quite so sure about that, because I don't think he was extending the same courtesy to Alex Botten with his foundational principles, that he experiences this particular reality using his cognitive faculties and all of that sort of thing. I don't think he was extending that, but I think that's a little misleading in the first place, because I don't think it's that your foundational principles or your presuppositions don't have to be justified. It's really that they can't be justified. That's the honest way to frame that. I start with these presuppositions, and yes, I have no way to ultimately justify them. And neither can you. And we go, and then we can actually get to, which is unfortunate that the discussion didn't go there, but I think there's a reason. We could actually get to, okay, you have your presuppositions, I have mine. Let's look at our worldviews and see how they answer deep philosophical problems. Based on Jason Peterson or Sye Ten Bruggencate's foundational principles, that would mean accessing Scripture. And I think that's why Jason didn't let it go that far. Because, of course, to have any kind of honest debate, you can't say, I'm gonna utilize this evidence, but you don't get to cross-examine my evidence. And I think that's why we don't go there. Sye Ten Bruggencate has never allowed a cross-examination of Scripture. And I think that's why, because, of course, if you're going to say that, laws of non-contradiction and uniformity of nature and these things are only intelligible on that worldview, and then you go and look at the source documentation for the worldview and you find contradictions and abandonments of uniformity of nature, among other things, well, that's going to cause a bit of a problem. And I think saying, well, you can't understand Scripture because you have an unregenerate mind or whatever, is just a further moving of the goalpost. Either way, it's not a compelling reason to accept the theology. But it goes, of course, further than that. The one thing that I don't see very often, and I would be interested to see how this would go about, would be if someone were to say, well, I don't know. I don't know everything, but I'm still uncompelled by your worldview, and I still see you're making just bald assertions, but your justifications don't satisfy me. And to see where that would go, because of course, just because you don't have the answer to everything is not any reason to accept a bad reason if you assess it as bad. I could go back easily, of course, to the example of volcanoes and Pele. Back at one time, everybody would be suggesting the reason for volcanoes, and I might say, I don't think so. I don't think that there's a god named Pele that is causing these lava flows. And it might be said, well, you don't have an answer, you don't know, so you have to accept our suggestion. And it could even be further said that, well, our theory, our framework of Pele actually explains a lot of the things. Well, that still doesn't mean that I'm forced to accept that if I don't have a different explanation. I would be more right in that instance to say, well, I don't know what the cause is of these lava flows, but I'm not convinced by your explanation. That would be the more correct approach. And so I think the same thing applies here. Just because I don't know everything, just because my belief set may not explain everything, it doesn't mean that I should accept your worldview, because the framework explains many things. And that this will take me to the Sye Ten Bruggencate with Matthew Steele discussion. And I thought it was a good one, actually. I may soften a little bit on my take on Sye Ten Bruggencate, because I've come to realize from listening to that discussion, it's not that he's a prick, it's just that's the way he carries himself. Because I think he was trying to be, fairly amicable with Matthew Steele, and he still comes off very abrasive. And I think that's just maybe the way he kind of carries himself. It's just who he is, which is not really conducive, I don't think, to good discussion, but I'm willing to overlook it, I think, a little more now than I used to. There's a few things that Sye said, and I haven't listened to the whole thing yet, but there's a few things that he said that really got me to thinking again about this whole issue of honesty within discussion and the practical use of philosophy versus these brain in a vat scenarios. One of the things that Sye was saying is that, on atheism or in your worldview, you can't really know anything because you don't make an appeal to anything external. And I think that's actually the problem, is making an appeal to the external, or it can be. Because again, we can't validate the external. Sye Ten Bruggencate has no more way of knowing whether anything external exists than an atheist. He hasn't solved the problem of solipsism by mere assertion, and that's really what he has are assertions. And that's fine. I'm fine with someone saying, if my worldview is true, then I can know these things. Fair enough. And I believe my worldview is true. Fair enough. But to make the leap from, if my worldview is true, then I can know things, God exists. What happened to if? What happened to the honesty of if? Because again, Sye Ten Bruggencate has no more way of knowing. They got into the discussion of face down on a stretcher, in a room, and what's the right reality. That's one that gets me as well. The right reality, please, again, demonstrate for me the wrong reality. The right reality is the only reality in which I am aware and have any capability of thought or anything else. There is no other reality. If I awake from this reality into a different reality, and that's the right reality, it's only right because it's the one I'm then aware of. The only one that I have any control over my own thoughts in. He also said several times that you have to make an appeal to omniscience. And this gets back to me to this whole concept of certainty. You're making an appeal to omniscience, but you haven't demonstrated that omniscience even exists. You're making an appeal to it, that's fine. I'm totally fine with saying I'm making an appeal to an omniscient being that I believe exists. But to go from making an appeal to omniscience to then acting as though you have made an appeal to an actual omniscience, and that omniscience has given you knowledge and information accurately, without a doubt. That's a different story. That's a leap. That's, again, back to the same certainty. Could an all-knowing, all-powerful God reveal things to us such that we can know them for certain? Yes. But does certainty mean that you've been given that revelation? Not necessarily. There are many Christians who are certain that we live in a geocentric solar system based on the same scripture, based on revelation. The same revelation. Who's right? Both are certain. The heliocentric Christian and the geocentric Christian are both certain. Boy, they're certain. Watch some Ferdy Boy videos. Pretty certain. The certainty doesn't mean anything. And an appeal to omniscience doesn't mean anything unless you can demonstrate the omniscience. And of course, that hasn't happened. And that's really the only issue that I have with Sye Ten Bruggenkate's approach. Is dogs barking? One moment, please. All right, where was I? Maybe this is a good time as any to wrap things up. So again, the issue for me is just one of intellectual honesty. Sye said something at the beginning of the discussion with Matthew Steele about being a proponent of atheism. And I'm not sure how much a person can be a proponent of disbelief. I think it's not about being a proponent of atheism. It's about analyzing truth claims and demanding some sort of an accounting for empirical claims, claims of existence, existential claims, and rejecting those claims if the burden of proof isn't met. In my estimation, I don't think I'm a proponent of atheism because that would be sort of making the absolute claim that there's no possibility that there are any gods. And I frankly don't know. But when I'm faced with an argument for a God, I'm going to assess it. And if someone's going to come along and say, if my worldview is true, here's a framework. If my worldview is true, then I can know things and et cetera, et cetera. And maybe you can't know things based on your worldview, based on this framework. But it's a leap to go from that to saying, therefore my worldview is absolutely true. You're denying the truth in your unrighteousness. You're going to hell, etc., etc. We haven't established any of that. All we've established is if your worldview is true, this framework would hold then. But we haven't established that it is true. And that's the leap that frustrates me. That's the leap, to me, of dishonesty. And the same thing with Jason Peterson. I mean, this is why people have developed alternate frameworks, because I could do the same thing, right? I could develop a framework and say, if my framework is true, then I can know things. And actually, I could develop a framework which necessitates that their God actually can't exist. And of course, they reject that. They say, oh, you're leaving your worldview. You're leaving atheism. The only way you can defend atheism is to leave atheism. No, I'm talking about hypotheticals here. I'm talking about thought experiments. Just because one develops a framework that makes sense, that fills all the logical problems, doesn't mean that framework is accurate. That's very easy to do, actually. And I think that's what Christianity has done. is developed a framework which answers some of the questions and gives people this sense of certainty. And then they actually are able to approach people who don't buy the framework, and even maybe someone who says, yeah, I'm not really sure, but I'm not buying what you're selling, and say, listen, your worldview is absurd because you don't have answers to these questions. Well, again, I'll send you back to the Pele example. Just because I don't have all the answers doesn't mean that you are correct by default, because you've answered some of these deep philosophical questions. But again, I don't think that it would have gotten to that between Jason Peterson and Alex Botten. Regardless, I think Jason Peterson was quite content to keep away from actually having to present any of the philosophical answers to problems that he was alluding to when they were discussing things early. I think he was quite content to keep Alex Botten on the defensive. And again, that's why I don't feel like there's any meaningful discussion that can take place with these people, because they're not interested in it. They're interested in making bold assertions. They're not interested in any kind of cross-examination or internal critique of their worldview. And, I mean, in some ways I can't really blame them, because that's been done, right? The internal critique of Christianity has been done for a long time, and so maybe they're a little bit tired of it. I know Sai is. But anyway, just a few thoughts on those couple of videos. Apologize for the rambling nature of this one. Thanks very much for watching.